The year was 1915. While Europe bled itself dry in the trenches of the First World War, America's most powerful industrialist was building something else entirely, a private kingdom along the Rouge River in Dearborn, Michigan. Behind its thick Ohio limestone walls, Henry Ford, the man who put the world on wheels, was constructing what he believed would be his ultimate achievement. Not a factory, not a company, a home, a fortress, a monument to everything he had conquered. He called it Fairlane, 56 rooms, 1,300 acres, a self-sufficient estate with its own hydroelectric power plant, its own telephone exchange, its own farm, its own greenhouses. A place designed so completely under one man's control that the outside world could be shut out entirely. By 1915, Ford was producing half of all automobiles in the United States. His fortune was incomprehensible. His name was known in every country on earth. And yet, behind those limestone walls, something was quietly going wrong. This is the story of Fairlane, one of the most extraordinary private estates ever built on American soil. But it is not simply the story of a mansion. It is the story of ambition carried past its natural limit, of a father who built an empire and destroyed his only son in the process, of a wife who watched both men decline and could save neither, of a house that outlasted everyone who lived in it, standing today as a partial ruin, a partial museum, and a monument to the terrible cost of needing to control everything. What happened inside those walls was kept quiet for decades. The public saw the genius. The family knew the rest. If you're drawn to the untold histories of America's great Gilded Age estates, the wealth, the wreckage, and everything the official record leaves out, subscribe now and turn on notifications. And leave a comment below. Which estate should we investigate next? This is the dark story of Henry Ford's Fairlane. To understand Fairlane, you first have to understand the man who built it, and to understand Henry Ford, you have to start where he started, in the dirt. Ford was not born into wealth. He entered the world on July 30th, 1863, in a simple farmhouse in Springwells Township, Michigan, now absorbed into the city of Dearborn. His father, William Ford, was an Irish immigrant who had crossed an ocean and broken his back, turning Michigan soil into something livable. William expected his son to do the same, to farm, to endure, to inherit nothing more than the land beneath his feet. Henry had other intentions entirely. From his earliest years, the boy was possessed by mechanisms, not crops, not cattle, gears, springs, the invisible logic of how things moved. At age 12, he received his first pocket watch. Within hours, he had taken it completely apart, laying each tiny component on a workbench, studying the system with the focused intensity of a surgeon. By 13, he was repairing watches for neighbors throughout the rural community. His father watched this with growing unease, sensing that the farm was already losing him. He was right. At 16, Henry Ford walked away from the fields and never looked back. He took a job as an apprentice machinist at James F. Flower and Brothers in Detroit, earning $2.50 a week, a meager sum even by the standards of 1,879. But the money was beside the point. Henry was surrounded by engines, by precision, by the future. He spent 3 years absorbing everything he could about mechanical engineering, working additional jobs at night to cover his living costs, including a position at the Detroit Dry Dock Company, where he repaired ship engines' massive, thundering constructions of iron and steam that he found endlessly compelling. Then, on April 11th, 1888, something happened that would shape the rest of his life in ways no engine ever could. Henry Ford married Clara Jane Bryant, a farmer's daughter from Greenfield Township. Clara was quiet and patient, two qualities Henry conspicuously lacked. While the rest of the world saw an eccentric tinkerer squandering his time on mechanical fantasies, Clara saw genius. Unproven, unglamorous, grease-stained genius, but genius nonetheless. She would become his anchor through every failure and his most faithful witness through every triumph. She would also, decades later, become the quiet casualty of the life he built around himself. The couple's early years were modest. Henry tried farming briefly, at Clara's gentle urging. His heart wasn't in it. His mind was already somewhere else, fixed on engines, on motion, on the particular problem of the horseless carriage. In 1891, he joined the Edison Illuminating Company in Detroit as an engineer. Within 2 years, his instincts and relentless competence earned him a promotion to chief engineer, bringing with it both financial stability and, crucially, time, free time, workshop time. Time to disappear each night into a small brick shed behind their home on Bagley Avenue and build something that had never existed before. He called it the quadricycle, a primitive automobile powered by a 2-cylinder, 4-horsepower engine assembled by lamplight from scattered tools and oil-stained blueprints, while Clara brought him coffee and sandwiches and the city slept around them. On June 4th, 1896, at 2 o'clock in the morning, it was finished. There was just one problem. The machine was too wide to fit through the shed door. Henry Ford picked up an axe and demolished part of the brick wall. He did not hesitate. He did not reconsider. Obstacles were simply problems with solutions, and walls were no exception. Moments later, the quadricycle rolled out onto the rain-slicked streets of Detroit. Henry sat at the tiller, Clara watching from the doorway, his assistant James Bishop following behind on a bicycle. The machine sputtered, coughed, and then roared. Ford drove through the empty streets at nearly 20 miles per hour, a speed that, in 1896, felt like something borrowed from the future. The age of the automobile had begun. Henry Ford intended to own it. 2 failed companies followed the Detroit Automobile Company in 1899 and the Henry Ford Company in 1901 before he finally got it right. On June 16, 1903, the Ford Motor Company was incorporated with $28,000 raised from 12 investors willing to bet on a man most of the business world had already written off twice. The early months were precarious. Bankruptcy was a constant presence. But Ford had a vision that went beyond survival. He wanted to build a car so affordable, so durable, so democratically available that it would transform American life, not just for the wealthy, but for the families who had never imagined owning anything with an engine. That vision arrived on October 1st, 1908, the Model T. Priced at $825, expensive for a working family, but dramatically cheaper than any comparable vehicle, the Model T was sturdy, straightforward to repair, and built for the rough, unpaved reality of American roads. Ford sold over 10,000 inches its first year. By 1913, that number had reached 182,000 and was still climbing. But the car itself was only half the story. The other half was how it was made. In 1913, Ford and his engineers introduced the moving assembly line at the Highland Park plant in Michigan. The principle was elegant in its simplicity. The car moved to the workers, not the workers to the car. Each man performed a single task, repeated thousands of times per day, as the vehicle progressed down the line. Assembly time for a Model T collapsed from 12 hours and 8 minutes to 1 hour and 33 minutes. By 1925, the price had dropped to $260 less than 3 months' wages for the men who built it. Ford understood something his competitors didn't. His workers were also his customers. On January 5th, 1914, he made that philosophy explicit. Ford announced he would pay his workers $5 a day, more than double the prevailing industrial wage, and cut the workday from 9 hours to 8. Critics called it reckless. Some called it socialism. Ford called it good business, and he was right. Turnover at Ford plants collapsed. Productivity surged. Thousands of men flooded Detroit looking for work, and the Ford Motor Company became something approaching a legend. By 1915, Henry Ford was producing half of all the automobiles in the United States. He was 52 years old. His personal fortune had grown to a scale that was genuinely difficult to comprehend, even for the men who managed it. And so he decided it was time to build a home. Not a showpiece, not a declaration to society. Henry Ford had no patience for the theatrical excess of old money, for the Newport cottages and Fifth Avenue palaces designed entirely to impress people he didn't respect. What he wanted was something different, a private sanctuary along the Rouge River in Dearborn, where he could think without interruption, work without interference, and control every variable of his existence with the same precision he applied to his factories. He would call it Fairlane. It would become his masterpiece, his obsession. And, in ways he never anticipated, his undoing. The site Henry Ford chose for his estate was not a coincidence. It was a statement. Situated along the Rouge River in Dearborn, Michigan, 8 miles west of Detroit, the land carried a weight that no other location could. This was Ford country, the soil his father had worked, the landscape Henry had stared at as a boy and quietly vowed to escape. Now he was coming back, not as a farmer's son, as an industrial emperor, and he intended the return to be permanent, absolute, and entirely on his own terms. Ford purchased 1,300 acres along the river. The scale alone announced his intentions. This would not be a country retreat or a summer residence. It would be a self-contained world with its own power plant, its own water supply, its own working farm and greenhouses, its own telephone exchange, nothing left to chance. Nothing dependent on systems he did not personally control. Construction began in 1914 and continued for 3 years, employing hundreds of craftsmen, masons, carpenters, and laborers working to specifications, so exacting that supervisors kept written records of every material decision Ford made. When completed, the main house measured 31,000 square feet across 56 rooms. But describing Fairlane by the numbers misses the point. This was not a house assembled for size. Every detail, every panel, every threshold, every pane of glass was selected with the same precision Ford applied to an engine component. Nothing was approximate, nothing was good enough. Everything was exactly right, or it was done again. The exterior walls were cut from Ohio limestone, each block hand-fitted to create a facade that read simultaneously as fortress and residence. The stone reached 3 feet thick in places, and it changed character with the light warm and honeyed at dusk, cold and severe under a gray Michigan sky, as if the house itself had moods. Over 42,000 red clay roof tiles were imported from Spain, each one inspected individually before installation, laid in a traditional Mediterranean pattern designed to endure for centuries. Ford did not build for the present, he built for permanence. Inside, the house announced itself immediately. The main entrance opened into a reception hall, 40 feet long and 24 feet wide, with ceilings rising 16 feet overhead. The walls were paneled in dark English oak aged 7 years before installation to prevent warping. Each panel hand-carved with geometric patterns drawn from arts and crafts design principles. The floor was laid in dark walnut parquet. Over 4,000 individual pieces fitted together in concentric circles and geometric gradations from dark to light. It took master craftsmen 6 months to complete. Walking across it felt less like crossing a room than crossing a work of art. From the reception hall, the house opened into its principal living spaces. The sitting room, Ford refused to call it a living room, finding the term insufficiently modest, measured 36 by 24 feet, with floor-to-ceiling windows along the southern wall, framing uninterrupted views of the Rouge River Valley. The coffered oak ceiling was carved with leaves, acorns, and climbing vines, a quiet nod to Ford's lifelong tension between the natural world and the industrial one. The room contained 7 distinct seating areas, each anchored by its own fireplace, 7 fireplaces in a single room, each built from a different material: Carrara marble, fieldstone pulled from the estate's own land, colonial red brick, limestone with Gothic carvings. The largest, positioned at the eastern end, stood 8 feet wide and 6 feet tall, deep enough to accommodate 4-foot logs. On winter evenings, the flames threw long shadows across the oak panels and filled the room with the smell of burning hickory. Each window was custom-made, its leaded glass containing over 200 individual pieces per installation, hand-blown in Germany, with subtle variations in thickness that bent and softened the views of the garden and river beyond. Across all 168 windows throughout Fairlane, the effect was the same. The outside world rendered beautiful, slightly distorted, and safely distant. The formal dining room, seated 24 at a single mahogany table, 1 unbroken slab, 16 feet long and 6 feet wide, cut from a tree, estimated at over 400 years old, when felled in the forests of Honduras. The wood had been kiln dried for 3 years, then hand-polished to a mirror finish. Above it hung 3 Bohemian crystal chandeliers, each containing more than 300 individual prisms arranged to throw fractured light across the walls and ceiling. Each chandelier weighed over 200 pounds and required a concealed pulley system just to lower it for monthly cleaning. The walls were covered in silk damask wallpaper, hand-woven in Lyon, France, $80 per yard in 1915, when the average American worker earned $20 per week. More than 400 yards lined those walls. The dining room's wall coverings alone cost more than most families earned in a decade. Ford's private study was smaller and more telling. Positioned in the northwest corner of the main floor to catch the morning light, it measured 24 by 18 feet, intimate by Fairlane standards, but designed entirely around one man's habits and preferences. Floor-to-ceiling cherrywood bookcases held over 2,000 volumes. A single Persian carpet, hand-woven with more than 400 knots per square inch in deep blues, reds, and golds, covered the floor at a cost of $6,000. At the room's center stood Ford's walnut desk, 9 feet long, with 22 lockable drawers. Its surface, hand-tooled leather bearing his initials, replaced every 2 years from constant use. The study's most quietly remarkable feature was its lighting. Concealed indirect fixtures that washed illumination upward onto the ceiling and back down again, eliminating harsh shadows entirely. In 1915, this was cutting-edge technology. Ford had it in his reading chair. The staircase system reflected the same obsessive logic. Fairlane contained not one grand staircase, but 11, each designed for a specific category of person and purpose. The main stair rose from the reception hall in a graceful curve, 36 solid oak steps reinforced with concealed steel, its mahogany balustrade hand-finished to feel like polished glass. 3 separate servant staircases ran hidden behind wall panels and disguised doorways, allowing staff to move between floors without ever crossing the family's sightlines. The goal was the carefully maintained illusion that Fairlane ran itself, that meals materialized, rooms refreshed, fires appeared, without any visible human effort. 2 additional freight staircases handled furniture and heavy loads, served by an electric dumbwaiter large enough to carry a full dresser. The total step count across the entire system exceeded 800 individual treads. A servant making the full journey from basement laundry to third-floor storage climbed more than 140 steps in each direction, a distance many made a dozen times daily. The bedroom wing contained 12 guest suites, each with its own private bathroom, a luxury so unusual in 1915 that most American families still shared a single bathroom down the hall. Henry and Clara's master suite occupied the entire eastern corner of the second floor, 7 rooms for 2 people, the bedroom alone measuring 28 by 20 feet. The custom walnut headboard stood 10 feet wide and 8 feet tall, carved with wheat stalks and automotive gears, a detail so precise in its symbolism it reads almost like a confession. The master bathroom contained over 4,000 individually placed tiles in blue, white, and gold, hand-glazed in Toledo, Ohio, to Ford's exact color specifications. The floors were hydronic heated, hot water circulating through pipes beneath the tiles, so the Ford family never had to encounter a cold surface, even in the depths of a Michigan winter. A multi-head shower, extraordinarily rare for the era, completed the room. Skilled tile setters worked for 3 months on that bathroom alone. Every room in Fairlane was a version of the same argument, that with enough money, enough precision, and enough absolute control, a man could build a life impervious to inconvenience, to discomfort, to the ordinary indignities of dependence on others. Henry Ford believed this completely. He was wrong. But it would take years and considerable suffering before Fairlane proved it. Henry Ford did not merely distrust dependence, he found it intolerable. The idea that his home, his sanctuary, the one place on earth he had designed entirely around his own will, could be held hostage to a utility company, to an electrical grid managed by strangers, to any system that operated outside his direct authority, was simply unacceptable. So he did what Henry Ford always did when the world failed to meet his standards. He built his own. 300 yards downstream from the main house, on the south bank of the Rouge River, Ford constructed a hydroelectric power plant and dam that was, in its own right, a serious feat of engineering. The building itself was designed to match Fairlane's architecture, the same Ohio limestone walls, the same Spanish red tile roof, so that from a distance it looked like a natural extension of the estate. A graceful outbuilding. Step inside, and the illusion dropped entirely. Inside was pure industrial machinery, designed for one purpose: to make Henry Ford independent of the world. The dam stretched 320 feet across the Rouge River and stood 22 feet high, creating a controlled waterfall that dropped with steady, calculated force onto turbines housed in the plant below. Ford helped design those turbines personally. There were 3 of them, each generating 75 kilowatts of electricity, for a total capacity of 225 kilowatts. To place that number in context, the average American home in 1915 consumed roughly 1 kilowatt. Fairlane's power plant could theoretically supply electricity to 225 households. Ford used it to light his own. He also sold the surplus back to Detroit Edison, the very company where he had once worked as a junior engineer, a detail he almost certainly enjoyed. But electricity was the least of it. The power plant supplied Fairlane with pressurized water drawn from wells, drilled 800 feet down into the bedrock beneath the estate, where the water ran naturally filtered and cold. Ford had no more faith in municipal water supplies than he had in municipal power grids. The plant's coal-fired boilers generated steam that traveled underground through insulated pipes to the main house, feeding radiators in every room, including the closets. Those radiators were not utilitarian afterthoughts. They were cast iron, painted to match the woodwork of each room, fitted with decorative grills that functioned as much as furniture as heating elements. Ford also installed a rudimentary cooling system that circulated cold river water through pipes embedded in the walls, lowering interior temperatures during Michigan's humid summers. Primitive by any modern measure, but in 1915, it made Fairlane one of the only private residences in America with any form of mechanical climate control. The power plant ran around the clock. Engineers and mechanics worked in rotating shifts, monitoring turbines, logging output, watching for any deviation from the established norm. These men did not commute. They lived on the estate grounds in staff cottages, modest houses with their own families, their own small gardens forming a self-contained community whose collective purpose was the uninterrupted operation of Henry Ford's independence. Ford paid them $75 per month, plus housing and coal, generous wages for the era. In exchange, they were available at all hours, every day, indefinitely. Their lives were organized entirely around the needs of one man's estate. The arrangement suited Ford perfectly. It left the workers with rather less flexibility. Fairlane's private telephone exchange occupied the basement of the main house, a switchboard with dedicated lines running to every major room, to the power plant, to the greenhouses, the stables, and the various outbuildings distributed across the 1,300-acre property. A full-time operator managed the board from 8 in the morning until 10 at night. After hours, incoming calls routed automatically to the house manager's quarters. Ford was, by design, never truly out of reach, which was, of course, the point. Control required communication. Communication required infrastructure. Infrastructure required people whose lives were organized around maintaining it. The 3-story garage, connected to the main house by a covered walkway, held up to 30 vehicles. The ground floor housed Ford's personal collection, Model Ts, in various configurations. Experimental cars from his own engineering labs, vintage automobiles from the industry's earliest years that Ford preserved as historical artifacts, and select vehicles from competitors that he studied the way a general studies an enemy's equipment. The second floor was a fully operational machine shop, lathes, drill presses, welding equipment, a complete workshop where Ford spent weekend afternoons in grease-stained overalls, personally maintaining vehicles or running modifications. This was not performance. He genuinely preferred the company of engines to most people. 2 full-time mechanics kept the fleet in order and assisted when Ford appeared with ideas. The head chauffeur lived on the 3rd floor in a 4-room apartment, modest against the main house's scale, but well appointed by working-class standards of the era. 8 greenhouses covering more than half an acre extended Fairlane's self-sufficiency into the botanical. Steam heat from the power plant kept them warm year-round, allowing Ford to grow tropical orchids in the middle of a Michigan winter. His collection eventually exceeded 300 species, each labeled and documented in leather-bound journals maintained by the head gardener. Ford was genuinely fascinated by the intersection of agriculture and industry. He ran experiments in those greenhouses, attempting to develop automobile components from soybeans and other plant materials, early research that would eventually contribute to plastics development. One greenhouse was reserved entirely for Clara's roses, a concession to her preferences in a house where most decisions belonged to Henry. Varieties from around the world bloomed there in carefully controlled conditions, tended by staff who answered to Clara on this single matter. The working farm, dairy cows, chickens, pigs, draft horses completed the picture. A staff of 12 managed it, producing milk, butter, eggs, and meat for the household. Surplus went to Ford Motor Company's commissary for distribution to factory cafeterias. Even the farm was integrated into Ford's larger economic ecosystem, generating revenue from what might otherwise have been simply an expense. By the early 1920s, Fairlane received more than 300 pieces of mail, daily letters from industrialists, inventors, admirers, job seekers, conspiracy theorists, and everyone in between. 2 full-time secretaries managed the correspondence alone. The total staff required to keep the estate operational ranged between 50 and 75 people, depending on the season, including housemaids, kitchen staff, chauffeurs, gardeners, mechanics, groundskeepers, laundresses, a butler, and footmen. Most lived on the grounds. By the mid-1920s, the annual cost of running Fairlane had reached approximately $300,000, the equivalent of roughly $5 million today. For 2 people, Henry and Clara Ford occupied Fairlane largely alone, their son Edsel visiting occasionally with his own family. 50 to 75 staff members maintained a 31,000 square foot estate, a working farm, a private power plant, and 8 greenhouses for a household of 2. The mathematics were staggering, the psychology was more so. Ford had built the most self-sufficient private residence in America. He had engineered out every form of dependence he could conceive of, replaced every external system with one he owned and operated himself. And yet, for all its limestone and limestone precision, for all its turbines and steam pipes and private telephone exchanges, Fairlane would never deliver what Ford had actually been building toward all along. Peace was the one thing no power plant could generate. Fairlane was built to be a sanctuary. What it became was something else, a stage for one of the most quietly devastating family tragedies in American industrial history. Edsel Bryant Ford was born on November 6, 1893, in Detroit, a decade before his father founded the company that would define the 20th century and years before Fairlane existed, even as a concept. He grew up watching Henry Ford transform from a struggling mechanic with borrowed capital into one of the most powerful men on earth. And from the beginning, the weight of that transformation pressed down on Edsel with a force that never lifted. He was groomed for succession from childhood. The empire Henry built, Edsel would inherit. That was the plan, stated plainly and often. What was never stated, what Henry seemed genuinely incapable of understanding, was that inheritance requires trust. And trust was something Henry Ford extended to no one, least of all the people closest to him. In 1918, Ford named Edsel president of Ford Motor Company. Edsel was 25 years old. The title was real, the authority was not. Henry retained absolute control over every decision that mattered: product direction, labor policy, executive appointments, manufacturing strategy. Edsel held the office, his father held the keys. The arrangement was not a partnership, it was a performance, staged for the public, while the actual power structure remained exactly as it had always been, Henry Ford's alone. The conflicts between them ran deeper than business. They were conflicts of character. Edsel possessed a genuine aesthetic sensibility. He cared about design, about beauty, about the experience of driving a car, rather than merely the mechanics of building one. He understood, years before Henry would accept it, that American consumers were evolving, that they wanted style and variety, that General Motors was eating Ford's market share precisely because Alfred Sloan offered people choices, while Henry offered them the Model T in any color they wanted as long as it was black. Edsel pushed for modern, elegant vehicles. Henry dug in. The result was years of stagnation that cost the company enormously and cost Edsel something harder to quantify: At Fairlane, the humiliations were regular and deliberate. Henry would summon Edsel and his family for Sunday dinners, then spend the meal dismantling Edsel's proposals in front of his wife and children, sometimes with cutting precision, often with casual cruelty, as if the audience made no difference. Clara sat through these scenes with a face carefully arranged into neutrality, having learned years earlier that any intervention only sharpened Henry's contempt. She watched her son absorb blow after blow across that mahogany dining table and could do nothing. Edsel had married Eleanor Clay in 1916, the daughter of a prominent Detroit family, and together they had 4 children: Henry Ford II, born in 1917, Benson, born in 1919, Josephine, born in 1923, and William, born in 1925. The family lived in their own estate in Grosse Pointe Shores, a magnificent house Edsel had designed with architect Albert Kahn that expressed everything about him his father refused to acknowledge: intelligence, taste, a genuine understanding of how beautiful things are made. Henry disapproved of the house, of its elegance, of what he interpreted as softness. He believed Edsel was raising his grandchildren without discipline, without the grinding experience of scarcity that Henry credited for his own character. During visits to Fairlane, he would pull the grandchildren aside and deliver lectures on the corrupting nature of wealth, lectures delivered, without apparent irony, inside a 31,000-square-foot limestone estate staffed by 70 people. Young Henry II found his grandfather bewildering and frightening. Fairlane itself, with its silent servants, its cavernous rooms, its atmosphere of enforced formality, felt less like a family home than a place where children were expected to remain invisible and grateful. Meanwhile, Edsel was getting sick. From his early 30s, he suffered from chronic stomach problems, ulcers, the doctors said, brought on by stress and nervous tension. Anyone who understood the situation could have written a more precise diagnosis. He was president of a company he could not lead, answering to a father who would not relinquish control, carrying the Ford name into rooms full of people his father publicly despised. During the 1920s and into the 1930s, Henry Ford's anti-union positions hardened into something brutal: his Ford Service Department, effectively a private security force run by the former boxer Harry Bennett, intimidating and assaulting workers who attempted to organize. His early contrarian politics curdled into paranoia and isolationism. Most damagingly, Ford developed and aggressively promoted virulent anti-Semitic views through his newspaper, the Dearborn Independent. The paper blamed Jewish conspiracies for everything from jazz music to international banking. Ford distributed hundreds of thousands of copies of a collected series called The International Jew, which was translated into German and read with approval by Adolf Hitler, who kept a portrait of Henry Ford in his Munich office and cited him as an inspiration. The articles were not fringe commentary. They were Ford's own publication, bearing his name, financed by his money, distributed through his dealerships. Clara was horrified. She had Jewish friends in Detroit society and watched those relationships deteriorate under the shadow of her husband's name. She retreated further into her roses, spending long hours in the greenhouses where the world outside could not reach her. Edsel's suffering was more direct. He worked daily alongside Jewish executives and engineers who were brilliant, essential contributors to the company men who showed up every morning knowing what Edsel's father had written about them, knowing that the surname on the building was also the name on those articles. Edsel had to look these men in the eye. He carried the shame of it like a second illness, feeding the first. By the late 1930s, with Europe collapsing into war and the full horror of Hitler's regime becoming undeniable, Ford stopped publishing anti-Semitic material. He issued no meaningful retraction. The reputation damage was permanent. Then came World War II, and with it, the final act of Edsel's slow destruction. Ford's Willow Run plant, built in 1941, became one of the war effort's most remarkable manufacturing achievements, producing B-24 Liberator bombers at peak rates of 1 per hour. But Henry Ford was no longer functioning as a leader in any real sense. His mental faculties were deteriorating visibly, though no one at Fairlane would name it openly. He appeared at Willow Run to give contradictory instructions that countermanded Edsel's directives. Military procurement officers didn't know whose orders to follow. Managers learned to wait out Henry's visits and then quietly continue what Edsel had told them to do. By 1942, Edsel weighed 130 pounds on a 5'10" frame. His suits hung from his shoulders like clothes on a rack. His face had taken on the grey, hollowed quality of a man whose body is methodically giving up. He kept working. He kept showing up. He kept trying to satisfy a father who, at 80, was barely coherent and still incapable of offering the one thing Edsel had spent his entire life needing: simple acknowledgement that he was enough. Clara begged Henry to ease the pressure. Henry dismissed her. On May 26, 1943, Edsel Bryant Ford died at his home in Grosse Pointe Shores. He was 49 years old. The official cause was stomach cancer, metastasized from chronic ulcers. Those who knew the family well understood the longer story. Henry Ford's response was chilling in its blankness. He did not grieve publicly. He did not reflect. Within days of the funeral, he reclaimed the presidency of Ford Motor Company, an 80-year-old man in advancing cognitive decline, reaching back for the one thing he had never been able to relinquish, even at the cost of his only child. Clara Ford collapsed inward. She had spent decades trying to protect Edsel from the man she had also spent decades loving, and she had failed at both. She sat in Fairlane sitting rooms and stared at the Rouge River and said very little. The staff moved through the halls in whispers. Henry wandered the mansion at odd hours, giving orders to employees long since retired, asking after people who were dead. The power plant hummed. The greenhouses grew flowers, no one gathered. The garage held cars, no one drove. In 1945, under sustained pressure from the board and the Ford family, Henry finally and permanently surrendered the presidency to his grandson, Henry Ford II. Edsel's eldest son, 28 years old, handed the ruins of a company losing $10 million per month. It took Henry II years of ruthless restructuring and mass reorganization to save it. He did it without his grandfather's help, without his grandfather's guidance, and without ever quite escaping his grandfather's shadow. Henry Ford retreated to Fairlane and faded. The empire endured. The family it had consumed did not. By the mid-1940s, Fairlane had become something its architect never intended: a monument to diminishment. The man who had revolutionized American manufacturing, who had put the automobile within reach of ordinary families, who had reshaped the nature of industrial labor itself, was now shuffling through his own corridors in a state of advancing confusion. Henry Ford's mind, once one of the most formidable instruments in American industry, was coming apart quietly and completely inside the house he had built to last forever. Clara managed the deterioration with the same patient discipline she had applied to everything across 6 decades of marriage. She ensured the staff kept Fairlane immaculately, maintained meals served on schedule, rooms cleaned to standard. Henry dressed properly each morning, even on the days he couldn't identify the month or explain why he was wearing a suit. Medical staff moved through the house under carefully neutral titles. They were never called nurses. Henry Ford did not acknowledge weakness in himself, and Clara had long since learned that certain truths were better left unspoken inside these walls. His daily existence had contracted to wandering. He moved through Fairlane's 56 rooms in slow, irregular circuits, sometimes orienting himself correctly, more often drifting between time periods, uncertain whether he stood in his Dearborn estate or on a factory floor or in the farmhouse where he had been born 83 years earlier. He would settle into the study, lower himself into the chair behind his great walnut desk, and shuffle through papers with the focused expression of a man working, though his eyes registered nothing. He would stand at the windows above the Rouge River for long stretches, staring at the water without speaking, as if waiting for something he could no longer name. The hardest moments came when he asked about Edsel. He would turn to a servant in a hallway, or appear in the kitchen doorway, and ask what time his son was expected for dinner. The staff had learned to redirect these questions gently, a change of subject, a small distraction, anything to avoid the direct confrontation with a truth Henry Ford could not hold. Clara could not be in the room when it happened. She could not tell him again, could not watch the information land and then dissolve, leaving him unchanged, ready to ask again tomorrow. She withdrew to the far rooms of the house and waited for the episode to pass. Outside Fairlane's limestone walls, America was accelerating into a new era. The war had ended. Servicemen were coming home to a country that was building suburbs, buying televisions, paving highways. The automobile culture Henry Ford had done more than any single person to create was reshaping the American landscape at a pace that would have astonished even him. But inside the estate, time had stopped somewhere around 1920. The power plant hummed, the telephone exchange fielded diminishing traffic, the farm produced food for a household that barely ate. The greenhouses continued their quiet cycles of bloom and decay. The entire apparatus of Fairlane's self-sufficiency continued running, not because it was needed, but because stopping it would have required someone to acknowledge what everyone already knew. The great machine had outlasted its purpose. Then came April 7th, 1947. Spring rains that year were unusually heavy, and the Rouge River, swollen beyond its banks, poured over the dam at Fairlane's power plant with enough force to knock the generators offline. For the first time since the estate's construction more than 3 decades earlier, Fairlane went dark. Staff moved through the blackened hallways with candles and oil lamps, calling out to one another, trying to establish order. They found Henry Ford standing at his bedroom window in the dark, looking out at the flooded river and the silent, failed power plant below. For a moment, one of his last moments of coherent awareness, he seemed to understand exactly what he was seeing. He turned to Clara, who stood beside him in the candlelight. "Well," he said quietly, "I guess we're not as independent as I thought." Those were among the last lucid words Henry Ford ever spoke. That night he suffered what was almost certainly a massive stroke. The medical details were kept private, as everything about Henry Ford's decline had been kept private, but the result was unambiguous. He became bedridden, drifting in and out of consciousness through the remaining hours of the night, while the floodwaters surrounded the estate and the candles burned low. Clara sat beside him and held his hand, the man who had been her husband for 59 years, the genius and the tyrant and the damaged patriarch, leaving the world in the dark in the house he had built to conquer it. Henry Ford died at 11:40 inches the evening on April 7th, 1947. He died by candlelight in his bedroom at Fairlane, as the power plant he had constructed as the ultimate symbol of self-determination, sat, flooded, and useless 300 yards away. The symbolism required no interpretation. History had written the ending with unusual clarity. More than 5,000 people attended the funeral at Greenfield Village, the historical recreation park Ford had built on land adjacent to the estate. Industrialists, politicians, and factory workers stood together in something that was part mourning, part reckoning. Henry Ford had represented a specific and already vanishing species of American power, the singular titan whose personal vision could redirect the course of civilization. That era was closing. Corporate structure, institutional hierarchy, and collective decision-making were replacing the age of the individual colossus. Ford was its last great example and its most instructive cautionary tale. Clara remained at Fairlane after his death, but the house felt hollowed in a way that no staff or maintenance schedule could address. She was 77 years old, arthritic, and surrounded by the evidence of everything she had lost. Henry was gone. Edsel had been gone for 4 years. Her grandchildren were adults now running the company, building their own families, existing at the grateful distance that adult grandchildren maintain from the weight of family legacy. She sat in the sitting room among photographs of Edsel at various ages, as a boy, as a young executive, as a father holding his own children, and she moved through her days with the careful deliberateness of someone who has already said goodbye to most of what mattered. The staff worried quietly. She ate very little. She slept badly. The roses in the greenhouse bloomed on schedule and went unvisited. The gardens she had spent decades cultivating held no interest for her now. Fairlane was maintained with the same meticulous attention it had always received, every surface clean, every room ordered, every system operational, but it was maintained for no one. A palace sustaining itself out of institutional habit, its purpose fully extinguished. Clara Ford died on September 29th, 1950, at Henry Ford Hospital in Detroit. She was 84. The official cause of death was listed as general debility, a medical term that, in practice, means the body had simply decided it was finished. She was buried beside Henry and Edsel in the Ford family cemetery in Detroit. The family that had built one of the great American fortunes, that had transformed how the world moved and worked and understood itself, was gone. And Fairlane, the fortress Henry Ford had constructed to hold the world at bay, to make himself untouchable, to guarantee his independence from every force he feared, stood silent and empty behind its limestone walls, waiting for whatever came next. Nothing that came next would be equal to what had been lost. Clara Ford was barely cold in the ground before the question arose, quietly at first and then with increasing urgency. What exactly does one do with a 31,000 square foot limestone estate staffed by 70 people that no longer has anyone to serve? The answer, it turned out, was very little and then nothing at all. Fairlane passed to the Ford Motor Company upon Clara's death in 1950. The company was in the business of making automobiles, not maintaining private palaces, and its relationship with the estate reflected that priority immediately. For several years, Ford Motor used Fairlane sporadically, an executive retreat here, a high-level meeting there, but these occasions grew rarer with each passing season. The staff, once numbering between 50 and 75, was reduced to a skeleton crew of caretakers. The house that had required an army to function was now supervised by a handful of people whose job was essentially to slow the inevitable. The power plant was shut down permanently in 1951. The turbines that Henry Ford had helped design, that had run without interruption for more than 3 decades, went silent. Fairlane was connected to the municipal electrical grid, the precise dependence Ford had built his entire infrastructure to avoid. If there was justice in the irony, no one was present to appreciate it. The greenhouses went next. Without the steam heat supplied by the power plant, the climate-controlled environments Ford had maintained year-round simply ceased to exist. The tropical orchids, more than 300 species, each meticulously catalogued in leather-bound journals, died within weeks. Clara's roses held on longer, sustained by their own hardiness, before Michigan's winters finally took them too. The glass panes cracked in the freeze-thaw cycles, then shattered. Within a few years, the 8 greenhouses were skeletal ruins, their broken glass catching the light among the dead plants like scattered fragments of something that had once been beautiful and was now just evidence. The farm dissolved with similar quiet finality. The dairy cows were sold, the chickens vanished. The carefully cultivated fields that had produced food for the household and surplus for Ford's factory commissaries returned to wild grass, then to weeds, then to the kind of dense, indifferent vegetation that reclaims abandoned land with absolute patience. The barns stood open, their experimental agricultural equipment gathering rust inside, pigeons settling into the rafters as if the whole enterprise had been built for them all along. Inside the main house, the destruction was slower, more intimate, and in some ways harder to witness. Without adequate heat and consistent maintenance, moisture found its way into Fairlane's structure through every available gap. The magnificent parquet floor of the reception hall, 4,000 individual pieces of dark walnut laid by master craftsmen over 6 months, began to buckle and warp, the wood surrendering to the damp in long, raised ridges. The silk damask wallpaper in the dining room, hand-woven in Lyon at $80 a yard and installed with such care, peeled away from the walls in long, slow strips, falling to the floor in ribbons. The plaster ceilings developed cracks, then water stains that spread outward like dark maps of nowhere. The Bohemian crystal chandeliers collected grime until the light they had once scattered in prismatic arcs across the walls became a dim, yellowish gloom. Individual crystals fell from their settings and shattered on the mahogany table below. No one swept them up, no one replaced them. They lay there, season after season, as the chandeliers above them grew darker and more skeletal. In Henry Ford's study, the books developed mildew 2,000 volumes on engineering, agriculture, and American history, their spines softening and warping in the uncontrolled humidity. The $6,000 Persian carpet was consumed by moths and mice. The hand-tooled leather surface of the walnut desk dried and split. Across all 168 windows, the German hand-blown glass, each pane custom-made, each one a small work of craft, accumulated decades of grime, until the views of the river and garden they had been designed to frame became murky suggestions of the outside world rather than connections to it. Outside, the ground surrendered completely. The formal gardens Clara had tended with such devotion, the precise hedgerows, the geometric flower beds, the stone pathways, laid to exact specifications, disappeared beneath, advancing weeds and wild roses that no longer answered to anyone's taste. Lawns that teams of gardeners had cut weekly now stood knee-high. The stone paths vanished under vegetation. The power plant building, that limestone and tile structure, designed to match Fairlane's architecture while housing an industrial heart, took on the appearance of an abandoned factory, beautiful in the way that ruins are always beautiful, and deeply melancholic in the way that only failed ambitions can be. The turbines seized in their housings, rust crept across the bearing surfaces, the dam across the Rouge River developed structural cracks, and engineering assessments warned it could fail catastrophically without intervention. Local teenagers found the estate as local teenagers always find abandoned places. They climbed through broken greenhouse windows with flashlights, picking through the mummified remains of Ford's orchid collection, then worked their way into the main house itself, wandering through the empty rooms, their voices echoing off the oak panels and coffered ceilings. Graffiti appeared on walls. Doorknobs, light fixtures, and decorative hardware began disappearing, pocketed as souvenirs by visitors who recognized, however dimly, that they were taking pieces of something that would not be here much longer. Ford Motor Company, increasingly embarrassed by the estate's visible deterioration, cycled through options without resolution. They explored a sale to the University of Michigan. They discussed a donation to the National Park Service. They briefly considered demolition, before concluding that tearing down Henry Ford's home would generate exactly the kind of historical outrage the company could not afford. No decision was made. The house continued its collapse. In 1956, a severe storm stripped dozens of Spanish tiles from the roof and drove rain into the third-floor servants' quarters, saturating the ceilings below. Repairs were made quickly and poorly. In 1958, vandals broke into the house and started a fire in a second-floor bedroom, scorching the oak paneling and leaving smoke stains across the ceiling plaster before the blaze was contained. The damage was not catastrophic. The vulnerability it exposed was. Dearborn itself was changing around the estate's limestone perimeter. The small company town Ford had once dominated was becoming a standard American suburb, housing developments spreading across former farmland, shopping centers rising where orchards had stood, the vast acreage Fairlane occupied, looking less like a private estate each year and more like undeveloped real estate waiting to become something profitable. The 1,300 acres Henry Ford had assembled as his private kingdom now sat inside a suburban grid that had no frame of reference for what it once meant. In 1957, Ford Motor Company finally committed to a direction. They would donate Fairlane to the University of Michigan Dearborn, a satellite campus established on land Ford had previously given to the university. The estate would become part of the campus administrative offices, potentially a cultural and historical facility, something institutional and purposeful. The transfer should have been straightforward. It was not. Legal complications, disputes over maintenance obligations, and fundamental disagreements about what the property was actually worth delayed the process for years, while Fairlane continued absorbing damage, with no one willing to pay for its repair. When preservationists and historians were finally granted systematic access to document the estate's condition in the early 1960s, what they found was worse than even the most pessimistic assessments had suggested. Bathroom plumbing throughout the house had frozen and burst during underheated winters, flooding rooms and stairwells. The 4,000 hand-glazed tiles in the master bathroom, 3 months of skilled labor, Ford's exact color specifications fired in Toledo kilns, had been destroyed by water infiltration and repeated freezing. Entire sections had fallen away from the walls. What remained was cracked, stained, and structurally compromised. The parquet floor in the reception hall had warped so severely in places that walking across it risked going through it. The carved oak paneling showed wood rot wherever water had reached. The chandeliers, stripped of so many crystals, hung like the skeletons of their former selves. The estimated cost of genuine restoration, returning Fairlane to anything approaching its original condition, ran to several $1 million in early 1960s currency. $50 million or more by today's measure. The University of Michigan Dearborn did not have those resources. Ford Motor Company had the resources and declined to apply them. The situation had the particular hopelessness of problems that are entirely solvable in theory and entirely neglected in practice. The most self-sufficient private estate in American history was falling apart because no one could agree on who was responsible for saving it. Henry Ford had spent a fortune ensuring Fairlane would never depend on the outside world. In the end, it was the outside world's indifference that nearly finished it. There is a particular quality to abandoned grandeur, the way silence fills rooms that were built for noise, the way darkness settles into spaces designed for light that tends to produce stories. Fairlane produced more than most. As the estate deteriorated through the 1950s and into the 1960s, something else began happening alongside the warping floors and the peeling wallpaper and the seizing turbines. The caretakers, those few individuals left behind to slow the house's collapse, started talking, quietly at first, then with the kind of consistency that makes dismissal difficult. Lights were turning on in rooms that had no active power connection. Footsteps moved through empty hallways with the deliberate cadence of someone who knew exactly where they were going. Doors found locked in the evening stood open by morning. Windows latched against Michigan's winter cold were discovered unsealed at dawn, the curtains moving in air that had no business being inside. The most detailed account came from Robert Jameson, a caretaker who worked at Fairlane from 1954 to 1959 and gave a long interview to a local newspaper in 1977. Jameson was not, by his own description, a man given to imagination. He had maintained industrial facilities his entire working life. He knew what buildings sounded like when they settled, what old pipes sounded like when they contracted in the cold, what wind sounded like moving through cracked window glazing. He knew the difference between a building making noise and something else making noise. On multiple evenings, while conducting his final walkthrough before locking up, Jameson heard music coming from the sitting room, not ambient noise. Music specifically, the sound of Clara Ford's Victrola phonograph, playing the kind of popular songs that had been fashionable in the 1920s, the era when Fairlane had been most fully alive. Each time he entered the room, it was empty. The Victrola sat where it had always sat, silent and still, its horn aimed at a ceiling no one was looking at. Jameson also reported seeing a figure at the windows of Henry Ford's study, always at dusk, always standing with the particular stillness of someone absorbed in thought, looking out toward the Rouge River and the failed power plant beyond. The figure appeared on several separate occasions over the course of his 5 years at the estate. Each time Jameson crossed the hall and pushed open the study door, the room was empty, the walnut desk bare, the cherrywood shelves vacant, the last grey light of evening falling through glass onto nothing. Jameson believed, without particular drama, that he was seeing Henry Ford, the old man standing at the window of his sanctuary, still watching the river, still contemplating the machine that had failed him at the moment of his death. Other staff members reported a different presence. Clara Ford's perfume, a distinctive rose scent, recognizable to anyone who had known her, appeared without explanation in various rooms throughout the house. Her dressing room, predictably, but also the sitting room where she had spent her quietest hours, and in the ruins of the greenhouses where her roses had once bloomed under glass. The scent arrived without warning, lingered for minutes with genuine persistence, and then dissolved completely. No perfume remained anywhere in the house, no source was ever identified. The third floor, the servants' quarters, the hidden back corridors, the utilitarian spaces that had once housed the invisible labor, keeping Fairlane operational, unsettled the night shift security guards who worked the estate during the 1960s with a consistency that eventually became policy. Several guards simply refused to patrol those areas after dark, a refusal their supervisors quietly accepted rather than challenge. What they reported hearing up there was not random noise. It was purposeful voices in low, urgent conversation, the clatter of dishes being stacked and moved, footsteps traveling the narrow back hallways with the brisk efficiency of people on a schedule, the sounds of a household staff still at work, still serving a family that had been dead for years. Henry Ford's bedroom, the room where he had died by candlelight, as floodwaters surrounded the estate, generated the most disturbing reports of all. Visitors who entered that room described being struck, without preparation, by a wave of grief so complete and disorienting that several people left in tears and could not immediately explain why. It was not a vague unease. It was specific, the sensation of sorrow that belonged to someone else, pressing in from the walls of a room that had witnessed the end of an 3-year-old man who had built the most self-sufficient estate in America and died in the dark anyway. In 1961, a photography team from a Detroit newspaper arrived at Fairlane to document the deterioration for a feature story. Standard assignment. They worked through the house room by room with professional detachment. When they developed the photographs taken in the master bedroom, several images showed a figure seated in the chair beside the window, the chair where Clara Ford had sat, holding Henry's hand through his final hours. The figure appeared across multiple frames, shot from different angles, always occupying the same position, always rendered in the same indistinct, shadow-adjacent quality that resists direct examination. When the photographers returned to the room and examined it carefully, there was nothing there. No chair had been moved. No explanation was offered, because none was available. In 1965, a team of paranormal investigators from the University of Michigan requested and received permission to conduct a formal overnight investigation of the estate. They arrived with temperature sensors, audio recording equipment, and cameras loaded with infrared film, the methodological vocabulary of a field that was still working to establish its own credibility. What their instruments recorded over the course of a single night was sufficient to produce a report that the university filed without endorsement but did not suppress. Temperature drops of 15 to 20 degrees were documented in specific rooms: Henry's study, the master bedroom, the sitting room, without any detectable mechanical cause. Audio recordings captured what sounded unmistakably like whispered conversation in multiple locations, though no individual words could be resolved with clarity. Electromagnetic field readings in both the study and the bedroom fluctuated in patterns the investigators' equipment could measure but not attribute to any known source. The most striking evidence came from the sitting room, where the team had positioned a camera on a tripod programmed to expose a frame every 30 minutes through the night. Most photographs showed exactly what they should have: an empty room, dim and still. The fireplace surrounds casting faint shadows, the windows letting in whatever ambient light the sky offered. But 3 photographs, taken in sequence between 2 and 4 in the morning, showed bright spherical formations of light moving through the room at different positions in each frame phenomena, with no obvious source, no reflection geometry that explained them, no equipment malfunction that accounted for their appearance in 3 consecutive images and nowhere else. The investigators' written conclusion was careful and appropriately restrained. They had documented phenomena warranting further study. They declined to characterize Fairlane as definitively haunted. The report was exactly what responsible inquiry produces when the evidence is genuinely ambiguous, which is to say, it satisfied no one entirely and unsettled everyone a little. The stories accumulated. Fairlane began appearing on lists of Michigan's most haunted locations, drawing curiosity seekers alongside the historians and preservationists. Whether the phenomena were genuine manifestations of something that resists ordinary explanation, or the entirely predictable psychological response to working alone inside a decaying mansion freighted with one of the most dramatic family histories in American industrial life, is a question this documentary will not presume to settle. What is not in question is this: Fairlane was haunted, perhaps not by spirits in the technical sense, but by the weight of what had happened inside its walls, the humiliations at the dining table, the grief in the sitting room, the long silences between a husband and wife who had run out of things they could safely say to each other, the slow death of a son who had spent his entire life trying to earn something his father was constitutionally unable to give. Every room in that house held a memory, and in the particular stillness of abandonment, memories have a way of becoming audible. America has a complicated relationship with its own history. It builds things of extraordinary ambition, neglects them into ruin, and then occasionally, partially, and usually too late, decides they were worth saving after all. Fairlane's near rescue followed this pattern precisely. By the late 1960s, the historic preservation movement in the United States had found its institutional footing, galvanized in large part by an act of civic vandalism so egregious it became a turning point. The demolition of Pennsylvania Station in New York City in 1963, the tearing down of a Beaux-Arts masterpiece to make room for a sports arena, and a subterranean rail terminal had generated a level of public outrage that translated, over the following years, into organized advocacy, new preservation legislation, and a growing national consensus that certain buildings represented something worth defending. What had been lost at Penn Station could not be recovered. What remained elsewhere could still be protected if people were willing to insist on it loudly enough. Fairlane's advocates insisted. In 1969, the University of Michigan Dearborn formally took ownership of the estate and confronted a question that was simultaneously straightforward and paralyzing. What do you do with a 31,000 square foot limestone mansion in advanced deterioration that costs a fortune to maintain, carries enormous historical significance, and has no obvious revenue model? The university's initial instinct was institutional and pragmatic. Stabilize the structure to stop the bleeding. Convert portions of the house into administrative offices and conference space. Run tours if demand materialized. Full museum-quality restoration was deemed prohibitively expensive and operationally impractical, a conclusion that was financially defensible and historically unfortunate in roughly equal measure. Preservationists pushed back with arguments that were difficult to dismiss. Fairlane was not simply a large old house. It was the private residence of one of the most consequential Americans of the 20th century, a man whose innovations had reshaped manufacturing, labor, transportation, and the physical geography of the American landscape. The estate represented a singular and unrepeatable moment in the country's industrial history, built by a man at the absolute height of his power, to specifications that reflected his genius and his pathologies in equal proportion. To convert it entirely into filing rooms and faculty offices would be to erase something that could never be rebuilt. To let it continue deteriorating would be worse still. A compromise emerged, as compromises do, satisfying no one completely and representing the best available outcome given the constraints. The university would undertake selective restoration of the principal public rooms on the first floor, returning them to a condition that conveyed the estate's original character while adapting the upper floors for university functions. It was preservation in the partial sense enough to save the argument, not enough to honor it fully. Restoration work began in 1970 and continued in phases across more than a decade. The challenges were formidable from the first week and grew more nuanced as the work progressed. The fundamental problem was irreplaceability. The craftsmen who had installed Fairlane's parquet floors, who had carved its oak panels, who had glazed its bathroom tiles to Ford's precise color specifications, these men and their techniques belonged to a world that no longer existed. The lion silk damask wallpaper was no longer manufactured anywhere. The specific formula for the bathroom tile glazes had not survived. The German glassblowers, who had produced the hand-blown panes for Fairlane's 168 windows, were long dead, their methods undocumented. Restorers worked with what they had and made reasonable approximations where they couldn't. Damaged sections of parquet flooring were repaired where the original wood was salvageable and replaced with period-appropriate modern materials, where it was not a compromise visible to trained eyes and invisible to most visitors, which was probably the right balance. The dining room walls, stripped entirely of their destroyed silk wallpaper, were repainted in burgundy tones matched to small fragments of original fabric recovered from behind the baseboards and beneath decades of accumulated grime. The bohemian crystal chandeliers were taken down, cleaned piece by piece with the patience the work required, and reassembled with modern crystal replacements, standing in for the pieces that had shattered on the mahogany table below them over the years of neglect. The power plant presented its own distinct set of decisions. The dam across the Rouge River remained structurally compromised, a genuine safety liability that required resolution before anything else. After extended debate between engineers, historians, and university administrators, the decision was made to partially stabilize the dam as a historical feature rather than restore it to operational capacity or remove it entirely. The turbines were cleaned, painted, preserved in place, and reframed as museum exhibits, silent monuments to Ford's obsessive self-sufficiency, explaining to visitors how the system had worked without pretending it could work again. It was an honest approach. The power plant would never hum again, but it would endure as evidence. In 1971, Fairlane opened to public tours for the first time since the Fords had occupied it. Visitors moved through the restored first-floor rooms, the reception hall, the sitting room, the dining room, portions of the garden, and glimpsed, through the careful work of restorers and the lingering evidence of original craftsmanship, something of what the estate had been. The tours drew thousands of visitors annually, most of them drawn by the Ford name, by automotive history, by the particular American fascination with seeing how the extraordinarily wealthy once arranged their domestic lives. But the restoration's limitations were real and visible to anyone paying attention. The second and third floors remained largely off-limits, converted to university offices and storage. Their original character sacrificed to institutional pragmatism. Henry Ford's private study, the room where he had spent the most solitary hours of his life, had its custom cherrywood bookcases removed to accommodate filing cabinets. The master bedroom where he died became a conference room. The greenhouses were demolished entirely in 1973, too structurally damaged to restore, too expensive to maintain, even as ruins. Their concrete foundations remained, bare pads in the middle of overgrown garden space, marking precisely where Clara Ford's roses had bloomed through Michigan winters under heated glass. The partial restoration cost exceeded $3 million in early 1970s dollars, a significant sum that the University of Michigan Dearborn bore largely through its own resources, supplemented by state preservation grants and contributions from private organizations. Ford Motor Company contributed financially, though less substantially than historians and preservationists felt the estate warranted from the company that bore its founder's name. The gap between what was given and what was needed spoke quietly to the corporation's ambivalence about Henry Ford's complicated legacy, the genius it was proud to claim, and the history it preferred to handle carefully. Public reaction to the reopened Fairlane was divided in ways that were themselves revealing. Some visitors arrived and found the scale and surviving craftsmanship genuinely impressive, the coffered oak ceilings, the crystal chandeliers, the parquet floors still communicating the standard of quality Ford had demanded. Others left disappointed, having expected something more overtly palatial, more Versailles than Dearborn. This reaction missed the point in an instructive way. Fairlane had never been designed to dazzle strangers. It had been designed to satisfy one man's exacting personal standards. It was substantial rather than showy, precise rather than theatrical qualities that reflected Henry Ford's own deeply conflicted relationship with wealth and its conventional displays. The tours that guided visitors through Fairlane in the 1970s and early 1980s told a careful story. Ford's innovations received emphasis: the assembly line, the Model T, the $5 workday, the self-sufficient estate powered by its own hydroelectric plant. These were the narrative anchors, and they were genuinely extraordinary. The darker material was present at the margins, if present at all. Edsel Ford's slow destruction at his father's hands was mentioned gently, if mentioned. Henry Ford's anti-Semitism, his association with Hitler's admiration, the Ford Service Department's violence against organizing workers. These chapters were navigated with the particular delicacy institutions apply to histories they find inconvenient. Fairlane was presented as a monument to American achievement. The costs embedded in that achievement were left, largely, for visitors to discover on their own. Some did, some didn't. The house held both stories equally, regardless of which one the guides chose to tell. Through the 1980s and into the 1990s, Fairlane settled into the particular unease of a place that cannot decide what it is. Part museum, part university facility, part memorial, part unresolved argument, the estate operated in a state of permanent institutional compromise. Public tours continued on the first floor, guides moving small groups through the restored rooms, recounting carefully selected chapters of the Ford story. Meanwhile, directly above their heads, university employees worked in offices carved from former bedrooms, attended meetings in rooms where the Ford family had once eaten dinner in charged silence, typed administrative reports at desks, positioned where Clara Ford's dressing table had stood. The mundane machinery of academic life, running inside walls that had absorbed one of the more dramatic family histories in American industrial memory. The grounds shrank steadily. Henry Ford's original 1,300 acres, that private kingdom, designed to be entirely self-sufficient, were sold off, and developed piece by piece as the university expanded. Parking lots, campus buildings, and student housing replaced what had been forests and fields and working farmland. By the 1990s, Fairlane's remaining grounds had contracted to roughly 72 acres, still a substantial property, a fraction of the original vision. The Rouge River, which had powered Fairlane's turbines and framed its pastoral views, told its own story of decline. Decades of industrial runoff from Ford's own factories upstream, combined with suburban development and agricultural drainage, had turned the water brown and largely lifeless. The river that had made Fairlane possible, that had given Ford his power and his independence, now moved past the estate like a slow rebuke. In 2010, the University of Michigan Dearborn committed to the most comprehensive renovation since the 1970s restoration, a $6 million project encompassing new climate systems, electrical upgrades, roof repairs, foundation work, and the restoration of additional interior spaces. More significantly, the project reimagined the interpretive program entirely. For the first time, Fairlane's public narrative would address the full story: Edsel Ford's relationship with his father, Henry Ford's anti-Semitism, the family's dysfunction alongside its achievements. The estate had spent decades presenting itself as a monument to American success. The new exhibits would acknowledge, finally, what that success had cost. Fairlane reopened in 2013. The spaces were brighter, better maintained, more honestly told. New exhibits gave Edsel Ford his proper place in the history, his contributions to automotive design, his letters, the quiet portrait of a talented man ground down by his father's refusal to let go. Clara Ford emerged as an individual rather than an accessory. Henry Ford's anti-Semitism was named plainly, its consequences examined without euphemism. The study was restored to something approaching its original form: custom cherrywood bookcases reconstructed from photographs, a period desk installed in place of the original sold decades earlier. Standing in that room, visitors could almost inhabit the silence Ford had constructed around himself. But Fairlane remained incomplete, and probably always will. The upper floors stayed closed. The greenhouses existed only in photographs. The grounds were a shadow of what Ford had built. The house occupied a liminal condition, no longer a private sanctuary, not quite a complete museum, rescued from demolition, but never fully restored to life. It exists, as it always has, somewhere between what it was and what remains. Today, Fairlane operates as a wedding venue, a museum, a conference center, and a university facility. Couples exchange vows in the sitting room where Henry Ford once dismantled his son's ambitions over Sunday dinner. Business meetings proceed in rooms where decisions were made that shaped American industry for a century. Students cut across the grounds between classes, largely unaware of what the soil beneath them once witnessed. The estate receives approximately 30,000 visitors annually. Some come for the automobiles, the assembly line story, the industrial mythology. Some come for the architecture. A quieter group comes for something harder to name, a need to stand inside a place where extraordinary ambition and extraordinary damage occupied the same room simultaneously, and to feel, however briefly, the weight of both. The tour guides navigate this carefully. Henry Ford's ledger is genuinely complicated. The automobile, the assembly line, the $5 workday. These were real contributions that improved real lives at a scale few individuals have ever managed. But the same man published anti-Semitic propaganda that Adolf Hitler read and praised. The same man crushed his only son so methodically that Edsel Ford worked himself into a grave at 49, still trying to earn an approval that was never coming. The same man built his wife a palace of extraordinary beauty and gave her in return decades of loneliness she was too loyal to name. Fairlane holds all of it: the oak panels and crystal chandeliers, and the arguments that echoed between them. The roses Clara tended because the greenhouses were the one place Henry's shadow didn't follow her. The walnut desk where Ford sat shuffling papers he could no longer read, asking servants when Edsel was coming for dinner, the staff deflecting gently because no one could bear to tell him again. The power plant, accessible on special tours, carries the weight of the estate's defining irony. The silent turbines, the frozen control panels, the generator housings empty. Since 1951, they stand as the physical record of one man's conviction that he could engineer his way out of dependence on the world. He spent millions constructing that argument. He died by candlelight at 83, while the floodwaters rose and the turbines sat idle, proving it wrong. The University of Michigan Dearborn spends more than $500,000 annually maintaining Fairlane, excluding major restoration costs. By any conventional accounting, the estate is a financial burden. But history resists conventional accounting. Fairlane provides something that balance sheets cannot measure: a tangible, walkable record of what American ambition at its most extreme actually produces. Not just wealth, not just innovation. Also isolation, also grief. Also the particular silence of a magnificent house in which no one was ever truly happy. Fairlane had 168 windows and couldn't give its owner the one thing he actually needed to see. If you found this documentary compelling, subscribe for more investigations into America's great estates and the families who built and haunted them. Leave a comment below. Which mansion should we explore next? Every grand house has a story the official record doesn't tell. We intend to find it.